What is the most buffed move in Pokemon history? There are a few contenders, I think. One of the biggest being Leech Life, a move from the very first Pokemon game that in its initial form was dreadful. Leech Life, back in Generation 1, was an early game move with a measly 20 base power. This is paling in comparison to even Ember and Water Gun. 20 base power is truly dreadful. It has the added effect of recovering half of the damage dealt to opponent, but with such pitiful damage dealt, this is scarcely very useful. Leech Life remained exactly this way for 6 straight generations, an early game move that was never intended to be used in competitive or anything, or even in, honestly, even in the single player game. Compared to the moves you get around that time, Leech Life was unusable. If you faced a Zubat using this against you, your reaction was probably one of relief. But then Gen 7 came along, and the reaction to a Zubat using Leech Life transitioned from relief into pure terror, because Leech Life got an enormous 60 power buff, turning it into an actual attack, and one of the new best bug-type attacks in the whole game, in fact. 80 power is really good for a healing effect like this, compared to Drain Punch and Giga Drain, similar commonly used moves in competitive that have a healing effect. 80 power is even higher than them. They have 75 power. So Leech Life is outdoing those moves, actually. This has to be up there for most buffed moves of all time, right? I mean, it went from a move that was genuinely not even viable in the earliest point in Pokemon to now being above average for a healing move, and one of the best forms of bug stab in the entire game. This buff was exciting for many people. A terrible move from the early game becoming so much better is just a fun idea. Unfortunately, though, not that many Pokemon choose to use Leech Life in competitive, actually, which seems surprising. It's a great move in a vacuum, but in Gen 7, when this buff first occurred, the most relevant thing that got Leech Life in competitive was Buzzwole. A great move on Buzzwole, a bulky, physical attacking bug type that benefits greatly from bug stab damage and the healing effects. And Buzzwole's a solid Pokemon. Interestingly though, nothing officially OU ranked in Gen 7 got Leech Life in the generation where it was buffed, so in the most commonly played Pokemon format on Pokemon Showdown, you weren't really seeing Leech Life anywhere unless you saw the occasional Buzzwole. In Gen 8 it became more common as Buzzwole rose in competitive prominence in that generation. Now the most iconic user of Leech Life has always been Zubat. So in the lower tiers, is the Zubat family using this new and improved Leech Life? That seems like it will be a perfect new option for them. Well, actually not really. It's not really a great fit on any of these bats. These are poison flying types. They don't get stab damage from Leech Life. They're not bulky enough to really take much advantage of the healing. Bug coverage can be useful, but they don't really use bug coverage that much actually. And if they do, it's probably going to be U-Turn, which is a superior move that can pivot out and leverage the speed of a Pokemon like Crobat for some momentum. That pivoting effect is way more useful than Leech Seed's health draining effect. So the bats that are the guys who you remember using Leech Life back in Pokemon Red aren't even really using it, funnily enough. Crobat doesn't use it. Eviolite Golbat doesn't even use it in the tier of NU where it's ranked. It would rather just run Roost for its healing, which makes sense. Leech Life is a bit of a waste of a move slot on this when you need utility like Toxic and Defog. And then Zubat down in Little Cup isn't even a real thing. Nobody uses Zubat. It's not very good. So, regrettably, these bats aren't even leeching anyone's life. Maybe that's a good thing. Maybe I want to preserve my life. I don't want to give up part of my life to these bats. The most effective user of Leech Life is probably Gen 9's Low Kicks, who can get some pretty good value out of Leech Life thanks to its Bug Stab and Tinted Lens ability, which causes not very effective moves to deal double damage, essentially erasing resistances and hitting everything with neutral damage. Leech Life is a good 80 power Bug Stab option that it would run on its Choice Band sets. The healing can sometimes be relevant too, although Low Kicks is not exactly a bulky Pokemon. The healing can still be relevant, and that extra power. However, even Low Kicks is preferring U-Turn and also the new move First Impression. First Impression is a new 90 power bug move that has priority on it on the first turn it's used, similar to the effect of Fake Out. After the first turn you can't use this move, but Low Kicks is a very hit and run Pokemon. that often just switches in, clicks one attack, and then switches out. So first impression is usually just going to be your big bug stab move, because it's 90 power, which is even stronger, and it has priority on it. And you're often switching out after you attack anyway. So even low kicks is using Leech Life more as like a backup option if it needs to click the move more than once, or if it needs to heal for some reason. And even then it's competing for a move slot with other options like Sucker Punch, and Knock Off, the Dark Stab option. Definitely a good move on low kicks and a valuable tool for it, but it's not even its best bug type attack, or its best attack in general, which is kind of funny. In Gen 9 there is also Slither Wing, the past Paradox form of Volcarona, who makes pretty good use of Leech Life. It uses it exactly as you would imagine it being most effectively used. Leech Life here is its bug stab of choice, and also a nice healing effect on a Pokemon that actually has some bulk to speak of and can use bulk up to increase its defense. The healing from Leech Life is a great fit here. On a bulk up sweeper set, this is exactly where you want to use it. It's much like Drain Punch on a bulk up sweeper. Very similar idea, combining your main stab option with a form of healing, and getting more out of the defensive boost from bulk up too. So Slitherwing is a pretty perfect user of Leech Life, but it's also not the greatest Pokemon in Gen 9. It's good in the UU tier, it sees niche use in the OU tier. But even in Gen 9, Leech Life is not that prolific. Would we call this the greatest buff in Pokemon history? It is up there, I think. But at the same time, I think that we can do better than this. I think there are more buffed moves than Leech Life. What about the buff to Outrage? Outrage is a move that released first in Generation 2. And honestly, I even forget about the pre-buff form of Outrage a lot, because back then nobody ever used this move. It was terrible. Outrage at this time was a special attack, because all Dragon-type moves were special attacks, and it had 90 base power. It also had the effect of locking you into the move for 2 to 3 turns, meaning once you click Outrage, you are forced to use Outrage again for the next 2 or 3 turns randomly. And after this lock-in ends, you will inflict confusion on yourself. So these are 2 massive drawbacks to using the move. Locking in reduces your options. You can't switch out or use any other move, you have to use Outrage. This makes you very wide open for attack from the enemy. They can destroy you while you're locked into Outrage. Confusing yourself is also terrible. You introduce a 50-50 chance that you get to act, which is a terrible risk to take. Usually you would just want to switch out after using Outrage. And is it even worth all that effort? Because a 90 power Dragon special attack isn't exactly worth such drawbacks, especially when Dragon Claw is an option that's literally right there, which is 80 power without any of these drawbacks. A mere 10 power decrease to avoid these terrible, terrible drawbacks. So Outrage, you can make an argument that this is a worse move than Leech Life in its original state. I suppose I would be stretching reality a bit there, but I mean, does Leech Life lock you into it and put you in complete danger to your opponent? At least Leech Life doesn't lock you in and you could switch out after using it. It won't give you much advantage, but neither will Outrage, and Outrage will also actively throw your Pokemon at the enemy on a silver platter where they could just defeat you. And it's not even a very powerful move, considering that terrible drawback, plus you're confusing yourself. However, of course, as many of you probably know, in Generation 4, Outrage was buffed. With the physical special split, Outrage was changed from a special attack into a physical attack, which in itself is probably a pretty big buff, because a lot of Dragon types have high attack stats and want to use a good physical move. Its power was also increased massively from 90 up to 120. That is a massive power increase, and now Outrage is a good attack, and it actually is worth the drawback of locking in and confusing yourself, so much so that it became one of the most spammable attacks in the game, in fact. Pokemon like Choice Band Dragonite could use Outrage and even 2-hit KO resistances through sheer brute force. Steel types were the only type back then that resisted Dragon, and even they were struggling to take these big outrages from powerful Dragon types like Dragonite. This persisted in Gen 5, where Garchomp was available to use and unbanned, and Kyurem Black, with its enormous attack set, became an incredible outrage wall breaker when that came out in Black 2 and White 2. I think there's a case for Outrage being the most buffed move. Now, Outrage, of course, did get nerfed later due to the environment around it, because in Gen 6, of course, the fairy type was introduced, which was a massive punish to clicking Outrage. And also it allowed an easy way for a Pokemon locked into Outrage to just get follow-up KO'd. Even if you get a KO with Outrage now, a fairy type can come in and they are completely immune to the Outrage that you are now locked into. This made Outrage way riskier to use, and the initial risk of your Pokemon dying when they click it was back, because of the very common fairy type that is completely immune to Dragon. But it still had Gens 4 and 5 where the move was ridiculously powerful, to the point of being one of the most central moves in competitive Pokemon in those two games. Definitely considerable as one of the most buffed moves, but I still think there are more buffed moves to speak of. The move High Jump Kick actually existed all the way back in Gen 1, and initially it was a signature move that only Hitmonlee could learn. This move back then was actually one of the better fighting type attacks in the game because fighting type attacking options were so scarce, but it still wasn't very good. The move had 85 base power and a 90% accuracy. And this is a weird move because it actually changed a lot throughout the years. In Gen 1, the drawback for missing High Jump Kick was that you only take 1 HP of crash damage, just a single point of HP, which is not that much of a drawback actually. It's a pretty damn negligible drawback. So in future generations, they nerfed this move further by making the drawback worse. In Gen 2, now you take 1/8 of the damage that High Jump Kick would have dealt if it landed, instead of just a flat 1 HP, so you're taking a bit more crash damage now for missing. In Gen 3, High Jump Kick was changed again to deal half of the damage that the enemy would have taken if the move landed. In each generation they are nerfing this move further, until Generation 4 where they buffed the base power of High Jump Kick up to 100. It's actually a pretty significant increase, isn't it? But now the drawback has gotten even worse, which I guess makes sense because they've increased the power. There's a reason for the drawback to get worse because the move is more powerful. Now you will also take crash damage if the enemy is immune to the attack or they use Protect to block the attack. You will take half of their maximum HP in damage, which can often be a lot of damage. And if you just miss the move from an accuracy check, you take half the damage that the enemy would have taken, just like in Gen 3. But now you're taking crash damage in more contexts. They really kept iterating on this move, huh? They couldn't figure out what High Jump Kick was doing. What's the deal with High Jump Kick? Let's slightly change this one every generation. In Gen 5, finally the big buff happened, and High Jump Kick was boosted from a 100 power to a 130 power. But the drawback got even worse again. If the attack is not successful, meaning that if you miss against the enemy, or they protect, or they are a ghost type and are immune to fighting, you will lose half of your maximum HP in crash damage this time. But, to be honest, with the incredible power increase, which is really massive and makes this move even stronger in power than close combat and superpower, it's kind of a worthwhile risk to take, and in Gen 5 High Jump Kick became a more powerful option. Blaziken famously uses this move, and part of the reason Blaziken is so powerful in Gen 5 and got banned to Ubers is because it has this 130 power stab move that hits like a truck. In Gen 6, High Jump Kick became even more popular as Mega Lopunny learns the move, and Mega Lopunny is great with High Jump Kick because it has Scrappy, meaning it can hit ghost types with the move, so there's less risk to that crash damage. You can still fail against Protect, you can still miss the move naturally, but ghost types aren't a problem. Mega Medicham can also use High Jump Kick for incredible wall breaking with its pure power ability. So High Jump Kick became more common in Generation 6 and 7 OU, with these prominent Mega Evolutions taking advantage of the move to great effect. Even though it has a higher power, the risk of the crash damage makes High Jump Kick less desirable than Close Combat. Now, Close Combat always has a drawback of lowering your defense, but you'd rather have that than the crash damage and the inaccuracy, which can be devastating and ruin a sweep. And it doesn't help that some of the Pokemon that relied on High Jump Kick, like Blaziken and Hawlucha, now just have Close Combat, which is a way stronger option. But there's no denying that High Jump Kick did get massively buffed. Even though it has a weird history where it got nerfed a few times, I don't even know which High Jump Kick to compare to the most powerful version. But the final iteration of High Jump Kick is certainly a significant improvement over the previous versions, which weren't even used at all over other fighting type options back then, unless it was the only option you had. A pretty significant move buff that a lot of people don't talk about is the buff to Giga Drain. Giga Drain first came out in Gen 3, where it only had 60 power, with the half damage heal effect that I'm sure you're familiar with. A lot of people don't realize how weak Giga Drain initially was, and on top of that, it only had 8 PP. So Giga Drain was actually very easy to stall, with common Pokemon in the OU metagame like Zapdos and Moltres with Pressure, who resist Giga Drain and consume twice the amount of PP, meaning Giga Drain is a very limited resource. For this reason, Giga Drain was often actually a worse option than Hidden Power Grass, which has a 70 power and a 24 PP. You sacrifice the healing effect, but it's a much more consistent move. Some Pokemon, like Venusaur, even opt to run Razor Leaf instead of Giga Drain. Even though Razor Leaf has a 55 power, the higher PP count is very relevant, and it means that Razor Leaf is a genuine option. Now, some Pokemon did use Giga Drain in Gen 3, it wasn't completely terrible, but often it was used for lack of much better, or because you couldn't use Hidden Power Grass since you're using Hidden Power with a different type for coverage. And you can't run Hidden Power twice on the same set, of course. So that was often the reason you run Giga Drain, was just because there's no other grass move available. And it's pretty common to just run Hidden Power if you can, or run Razor Leaf or Magical Leaf if you have that option, which doesn't speak very well to the strength of this move. In Gen 5 though, Giga Drain was buffed to have 16 maximum PP, which is significantly higher, it's double the amount, and 75 base power. Now the choice of Grass Stab for most grass type Pokemon is between Giga Drain, Energy Ball, and Leaf Storm. These are the most common options, and Giga Drain is often the best of them because of the healing effect. It's not that much weaker than Energy Ball, and it has decent enough power to be a reliable stab option. Leaf Storm can be better if you want raw power at the drawback of losing some special attack. Energy Ball can be nice for a middle point, but Giga Drain is no longer like the worst of the grass options, and it's what you use if you have no better option. It's a genuinely viable one, and that was a big change, a big upgrade. Now, of course, you can't really make the argument that this is the most buffed move when Leech Life is similarly buffed. The Leech Life started as a way worse move with only 20 power, being buffed to a higher power move even than Giga Drain, but I thought I'd still talk about the Giga Drain buff. It's an often forgotten one that was very significant and kind of changed the game. I believe the Rapid Spin buff was pretty damn significant. Rapid Spin is a utility attack that was introduced all the way back in Gen 2. It's a physical normal type attack with 20 power, 100 accuracy, and the effect of removing various effects from your side of the field. Most importantly, hazards like spikes and stealth rock get erased from your side of the field. This is a very important move in competitive. It's counterplay to hazards. It also removes Leech Seed and Wrap and other binding effects, which can have occasional use, but it's mostly the hazard removal that use this for. This move was good enough as a utility effect, not used for damage or anything, just for removing hazards. But then in Gen 8, they went ahead and buffed this move pretty significantly. First of all, they buffed its base power from 20 to 50, which is not irrelevant. That's a pretty significant power increase. 50 power is, of course, still not that great, but dealing some actual damage with this move that is just used for its utility in the past is significant. On top of that, though, the unbelievable buff they gave to Rapid Spin in Gen 8 was that it now grants a speed increase, as well as removing hazards and Leech Seed, etc. Gives you a speed boost of 1 stage. That's huge. Now you're doing 2 things in one. You're removing hazards, and now you're probably faster than the enemy, and you can win the hazard war much more consistently. I mean, back before this Rapid Spin buff, moves like Icy Wind were used in hazard mirrors to ensure that you're faster than the enemy and you can Rapid Spin first, or taunt them or something. Now Rapid Spin just does that for you all in one. You outrun them while you're removing the hazards. And if you try to 1v1 a Rapid Spinner by making Stealth Rock consistently, they will eventually outspeed you, which is a huge problem, and then they keep that speed. Of course, because it's just a boost. You keep that until you switch out. The next Pokemon might be in a World of Hurt against like an Excadrill that's boosted up. That's a threatening Pokemon. In fact, sometimes Rapid Spin is used just for the speed increase now. Not even to remove hazards. You could just increase your speed on Excadrill, or in Gen 9, Great Tusk, And now you're outrunning Pokemon that you previously didn't. You can use this as a win condition. Sometimes Rapid Spin even does the last little sliver of damage against an enemy, because it has a high 50 power now. And then you get a speed boost on top, and that is 2 birds with 1 stone. If you also remove hazards on top of that, it's the greatest turn of your life. So this Rapid Spin buff is considerable. I mean, it was already a great move to begin with, used in every single generation for its utility. Literally from Gen 2 to 6, it is central to every single singles format. So it's not as if Rapid Spin started really bad and got buffed, but the buff is enormous. Like, it's a really massive buff to an already powerful move, so it's worth mentioning at least. Probably not the most buffed move of all time though, because of course, it was still a great move initially. There are more buffed moves, but it's a damn significant buff that probably makes the top 10 buffs of all time. I think that Future Sight is worthy of a shout out here, because Future Sight was a move released all the way back in Gen 2 where it was atrocious and you would never use it in a million years. But in later generations it became really, really strong and really common. So I think it's definitely one of the most buffed moves of all time. In Gen 2, Future Sight first released, and it was a psychic type special attack with 80 base power and 90 accuracy. But this operates very differently to most attacks, because Future Sight doesn't actually attack the enemy on the turn it's used, it attacks 2 turns in the future. What's interesting about Future Sight in its original state is that it actually deals damage to whatever is on the field based on the initial Pokemon that it was used against. So for example, if you use Future Sight against a Nidoking, they are weak to poison, they're going to take a lot from that, and then if they switch to a Blissey, they're actually going to take a massive amount of damage because it will calculate the amount of damage Nidoking would have taken. So in that sense, it actually does have some use because you can deal unexpectedly high damage to a switch-in that usually takes special hits very well, but they are taking a hit that a different Pokemon took in the past, which is sort of weird. Sort of confusing, isn't it? Future Sight worked that way from Gen 2 to 4, but then in Gen 5 it was changed. It was buffed a little bit to 100 base power now, and it also can't miss now. It's a little weird that it could even miss in the first place back in Gen 2 to 4, but now it can't. It's a move about seeing the future and seeing future events, and then you could be like, whoops, I actually misread the future, I was wrong about that. The spice that I inhaled to see the future has given me multiple different possible realities. In 90% of them, you take damage equal to the damage of Nidoking. In the 10% reality, you take 0 damage. Paul Atreides could not have foreseen that the 10% reality would come to pass in this instance. You idiot. How could you be so stupid to not see that one? But now the damage occurs 100% of the time, erasing potential timelines where disaster strikes. Now Future Sight also operates a bit more intuitively. Instead of calculating the damage of the move on the turn it is used against the target that was in back then and then dealing damage that should have been dealt to a different Pokemon, now it just acts normally like you would expect, where when the move strikes 2 turns later it calculates the damage that the Pokemon that's on the field is supposed to take. So it's just dealing damage to the Pokemon that's right there, which makes more sense, I think. In a way, you could view that as a worse move, because sometimes you do want to deal unexpectedly high damage to a fella that isn't prepared for such high damage, but also the power increase and the accuracy increase here are insignificant. And then in Gen 6, the power increase was even higher with 120 power, which is actually a really, really strong move. 120 power is great. And weirdly, this is like one of the better psychic type special attacks, because the fact that you queue it up 2 turns later means that you are queuing up an attack that's going to happen at the same time as a turn you're taking then. So you sort of hit them with double pressure, because you're going to have something in that is forcing out a switch, and then it's awkward for the enemy because they don't want to switch in to something that takes a lot from Future Sight. So it actually increases your ability to make mid-ground plays. For example, maybe you have a fighting type Pokemon in, and you know that the enemy is going to take the Future Sight hit next turn. And this is great because you can just use a fighting type move very reliably. If the enemy switches to something that is immune to fighting, like ghost types, or resistant to fighting, like a fairy type, they're going to take a massive neutral Future Sight, which has a really high power. So even in that instance, you're dealing a lot of damage. If they choose to go something that switches in on the Future Sight better, like a dark type or a steel type, guess what? Those are weak to fighting. So yes, they will be immune to the Future Sight as a dark type, but they're going to take damage from the fighting move that you're using. So you kind of have 2 attacks happening on the same turn, which is very difficult to switch in against. Not much can switch in against Future Sight plus another attack, and you can often cover like every option and apply serious pressure because of Future Sight happening in the future. Whereas a normal Psychic type attack is actually easier to deal with because a Dark type can just come straight in on that turn and prevent you from doing anything, or a resistance can come in. But queuing up the Future Sight makes it stronger, and it also has a higher base power than most Psychic moves, and it's accurate as well. The most famous user of Future Sight is Galarian Slowking, who uses it in Gen 8 a lot, and of course in Gen 9 too. In Gen 8, even Tapu Lele was using Future Sight. A lot of Pokemon were using Future Sight, and it's actually one of the best ways to apply pressure in Gen 8 OU, and still in Gen 9 OU, it's a very relevant move that is significantly better now than it was in its original state, where it was an awkward move to use, was a gimmick if anything. Now it's a genuine move that is a very interesting move, operating differently to most attacks that exist. I would call this one of the most significant buffs in Pokemon history for sure. Now, how about the one that you're probably all screaming about in the comments? The most noteworthy buff in Pokemon history. Probably. The most well-known one. The knockoff buff. To not mention this in this video would be absurd. Knockoff, one of the greatest buffs of all time. Knockoff was released back in Gen 3, where it was a special attack, because all Dark-type attacks were back then. It had measly 20 power, and it had the effect of removing the held item from the enemy. Now, even back then, this was not a bad move. A lot of people have the perception that this was like a niche utility move. It's actually a very good move, even in this state. But back in Gen 3, it's just that not many Pokemon got it. The only real notable Pokemon that got it were Hariyama and Armaldo, who are not exactly the most central Pokemon in the metagame, but they often use knockoff, and if not always use knockoff. And even something like Sableye has niche value because it has access to knockoff. Removing leftovers from enemies is significant. Removing Choice Band cuts damage output from enemies like Metagross and Aerodactyl and Dugtrio and can save your life. Even removing a berry could save your skin, like a Salac berry, preventing a potential sweep. Item removal is very good, and this crucially can't be affected by Taunt because it's an attack. So just the effect of removing an item is always good. It's one of those things that just always provides a bit of value. It's always good to remove an item, and there's no switch in for it. There's no immunity to knockoff, except like Muck with Sticky Hold, which of course is a very meta-relevant Pokemon that has ripple effects felt throughout time. So it's a bad move because it can't hit Muck, if you think about it. And in Gen 4, it was just changed to a physical move with exactly the same properties, and Clefable famously uses knockoff to great effect in Gen 4 with its new Magic Guard ability enhancing its defense, and knockoff being probably its most reliable bit of utility. Even in Gen 5, knockoff is used on Pokemon like Ferrothorn and the occasional Clefable there for its great utility effect of removing an item. But then in Gen 6, they went crazy mode, and they did something similar to what they did for Rapid Spin. They take this utility move that is an attack that's already really good just for its utility effect, and they go ahead and buff it enormously. For some reason. Knockoff had a massive power boost in Gen 6, from 20 power up to 65 base power. On top of that, it also had an extra damage effect if the enemy is having their item knocked off on the turn that you use it. If you are in the process of knocking off an item, this move has a 1.5x damage increase. So that's a higher damage move, effectively, than any Dark Stab in the game, really. Now, sometimes you do less damage against targets that already have their item removed or don't have an item because it's been consumed, or they're not equipping one, or whatever, or they have a Mega Stone, which can't be knocked off. But that's hardly much of a drawback when so much of the time you're dealing more damage than average for a Dark-type move, and you're removing their damn item, which is incredibly high value. Combining high damage Dark physical stab, or coverage, with this item removal effect is just unbelievable, and many consider knockoff to be the strongest move in the whole game, just because it does so much in one. And Dark is a great offensive type too. There's few switch-ins, there's no immunities to it, and knockoff makes it better because even if they do resist Dark, they're losing their item, which is going to have a permanent impact on them. So knockoff is a really massive buff, definitely more significant than the Rapid Spin buff, I would say. And in many eyes, the greatest buff in Pokemon history. I would disagree with that though. I think that there are greater buffs in Pokemon history. Amazingly, it might be hard to imagine a buff greater than this one, but I think that there are. One of the greatest contenders, I think, that has a genuine argument for being the greatest buff in Pokemon history is to Defog. Defog was a move initially introduced in Gen 4. And in Gen 4, this move is basically nothing. It's completely useless almost. What Defog does in Gen 4 is it lowers the target's evasiveness by 1 stage, and it also clears hazards from the enemy's side of the field. Not your side, but the enemy's side of the field. So if you have set Stealth Rock and Spikes and use Defog, you are doing the enemy a huge favor and getting rid of all that for them, which I don't know why you would ever want to do that, but that's what it does. Now, a benefit to Defog in Gen 4 is that you can remove effects like Reflect, Light Screen, and Safeguard from the enemy's side, but that is pretty damn niche and of course not worth a whole move slot for this incredibly specific purpose that in most cases is just going to screw you over because you're removing hazards, which are a central mechanic. You probably want to set hazards. The Defog was dreadful in Gen 4. In most scenarios it was an active detriment to you, and the evasion lowering is hardly useful. You might have a more accurate move next turn. It's a tiny little benefit that's not very relevant at all. The Defog, I think, is worse than Leech Life in its pre-nerf state. At least Leech Life does a bit of damage and heals you for like 2 HP. Defog is sometimes advantageous if they have a Reflect up. In that case, Brick Break is a way better move that is an attack that breaks screens. Most of the time this move is just going to get rid of hazards from their field, screwing you over. So you can't get much worse than that, to be honest. But then in Gen 6, Defog was of course buffed. And now, the effect that used to only apply to the enemy now applies to the whole field, including your side of the field. So now Defog has the incredibly valuable use of removing hazards from your side of the field, which is great. Now, it does remove them from the enemy's field as well, but that's okay. Oftentimes, Defog is used in a scenario where hazards are only on your side of the field, and it's still useful even if there's hazards on both fields. It's great utility. And a lot of Pokemon learn this move, a lot of flying types learn this move. Crucially as well, Defog can work against ghost types. Before, the only hazard removal in the game was Rapid Spin, which thuds completely against ghost types and won't remove the hazards if it hits into a ghost type. Defog is different, because it actually does work against ghost types, and it's a more consistent form of hazard removal. Defog went from actively detrimental almost to one of the best utility moves in the whole game that is used in pretty much every single competitive singles generation since this buff. In Gen 9, in fact, one of the huge problems in the metagame is that they cut Defog from a lot of Pokemon. The only OU ranked Pokemon with Defog are now Corviknight and Galarian Weezing, and half the reason they're even in OU, especially Galarian Weezing, is because they got Defog. If they didn't have Defog, they probably would not be OU viable. It's because of that they are good, because it's more important than ever to remove hazards, especially with Goldengo being around and hazard stacking being so strong with Ceaseless Edge, etc. The Defog went from pure garbage to one of the most important moves in the game. I would call that arguably the most significant buff in Pokemon history. There's one other contender though, I think, to Defog, and that is Teleport. Teleport was introduced all the way back in Gen 1, and this mostly has an in-game effect. Teleport can be used to escape the tunnels, I think, like an escape rope, and it can be used to flee a battle. But in a multiplayer battle, Teleport has no effect whatsoever. It is a literal useless move with no effect. Splash is literally better than Teleport because it has more PP on it. It could be used to stall. Defog is basically useless, sometimes actively detrimental. Teleport is literally useless. It genuinely doesn't even do anything. Up until, of course, Generation 8. All the way up in Generation 8, they decided to give Teleport an effect, which was a really amazing one. One of the best new moves in Gen 8, in fact. If you consider it a new move. It's basically a new move, because previously it didn't do anything. Teleport now has the effect of simply switching you out of the field. Pivoting you out like how Baton Pass can, or U-turn, etc. The difference though between Teleport and other pivoting moves is that it has -6 priority, so it will pretty much always go last in a turn. This actually makes it really strong, because you can guarantee that Teleport happens last, and therefore on a defensive Pokemon, you take the hit on that Pokemon and safely switch in to any Pokemon you want on your team. If you use other pivoting moves, like U-turn or button pass. Button pass is illegal in singles, but sometimes it was used in the past for pivoting. You know what I mean. If you use those moves and you are faster than the enemy, it's still good, you still have information, but you're going to switch in and take a hit from that enemy, you know? It's actually better for you to take the hit on the defensive Pokemon that has great bulk, and then completely safely switch in anything you want. This allows Teleport to enhance the value of really frail but threatening Pokemon, like for example Crawdaunt or Weavile. These Pokemon are pretty hard to switch in because they're so weak defensively, and they're vulnerable to a lot of common attacking types. They can't really switch in and tank a hit and then pose a threat. But Teleport is available on, like, Slowbro, for example. Slowbro has great defenses, the great defensive water typing. It can easily tank a hit and then switch out with Teleport. It's always slower, and then in comes Weavile, and Weavile suddenly is in completely safely, forcing something out. Same with Blissey. Blissey is amazing at taking a hit from any special attacker. Is the best special wall in history. Now, it can actually leverage its great defenses for some momentum, because you can switch right in to a powerful threat, and you can pick whatever is the best threat against whatever they have. You have perfect information now. You can switch in exactly what you want. And it's also great because if they switch, you can do the very same thing. They might switch to Dragapult. Okay, you go to your Zeraora, which beats Dragapult. It's faster. You can react to anything they do, whether they hit you or they switch. That's the strength of pivoting moves in general in Pokemon, but Teleport is arguably even better because of the negative priority, ensuring that it goes last in a turn, and therefore your frail switch in is going to be completely safe on the next turn. Teleport was a paradigm shift for Gen 8 OU and one of the most significant moves in the format, allowing for a lot more Pokemon to pose a threat and frailty being less of a problem for wall breakers because they have this way to switch in on the field so much more safely. Teleport was also distributed to a lot of Pokemon that are really, really good at taking hits, like Clefable, Slowbro, and Blissey. So I would actually probably say that Teleport is the best and most significant buff in Pokemon history. It went from literally doing nothing to now being one of the strongest pivoting effects in the game and reshaping the whole metagame around it. Defog you could still make an argument for, because arguably the hazard removal effect is even more important than Teleport. But I'm not even sure if Defog is stronger than Teleport. The pivoting effect is so good. It's also nice because it's a move, a status move, meaning it's not an attack, and therefore you can't be punished by Rocky Helmet, Flame Body, or Static, which can punish U-turn. A U-turn is obviously advantageous for being an attack, which is really good. Deals damage while pivoting, but Teleport has its advantages, not only for the negative prior, but avoiding all those contact effects. In Gen 9, in fact, they cut Teleport from all these Pokemon, recognizing that it was kind of overpowered on them, and could be a bit of a problem, especially with the higher power level of wall breakers that would benefit from Teleport in Gen 9. Now almost nothing gets Teleport anymore, but you can imagine if Slowbro got Teleport in Gen 9, it would probably be way more popular. Imagine like Toxapex with Teleport. That's a nightmare to imagine, isn't it? That would be incredible. I would say Teleport is the most buffed move, but Defog is also considerable for that title. Considering just how bad they were initially, Teleport literally being nothing and then becoming so much better, that would be my choice for the most buffed move of all time. But what do you think, folks? Let me know what your choice is for the most buffed move in Pokemon history. And thank you very much for watching.